Marcus Hale had spent 4 years inside Stonewater Penitentiary, convincing himself that the outside world could wait for him, that the woman he married would still be standing by the door when he finally walked out as a free man. But everything inside him shattered the moment he read the short, cold letter. His wife Laura had mailed a letter that slipped from a guard's hand and landed in Marcus's lap like a death sentence, telling him she had moved on and deserved better. Words that felt like acid burning straight through his chest, twisting into something dark enough to rewrite the man he thought he was. And while the prison buzzed with its nightly routines, metal doors slamming, guards shouting, inmates muttering threats and prayers, Marcus sat on the cold steel bed, gripping the letter so tightly his knuckles turned white. Because he wasn't grieving a marriage anymore. He was grieving the version of himself that had believed loyalty meant anything. And once that died, something far more dangerous took its place. He waited for lights out, steadying his breath, remembering the plan he had rehearsed for months with his cellmate, Riker. Risky, near impossible escape that depended on precision, courage, and pure, boiling ragend when the floodlights flickered during the routine generator switch. Marcus slid off the bunk, slipped through the narrow gap Riker had loosened in the vent grill, dropped silently into the laundry bay, and crawled under the transport truck that left every night at 10:17 p.m. He flattened himself against the freezing metal undercarriage, heart pounding as guards passed within inches of his face, boots crunching against gravel, radios crackling with static. And for a moment Marcus wondered if any of them could hear the hatred humming inside him. But the truck rolled forward, slow at first, then faster as it left the inner gate and approached the final perimeter where armed guards scanned every outgoing vehicle. And Marcus forced himself not to breathe while the beam of a security flashlight swept across the tires, pausing for a moment that felt like eternity before sliding away. The truck lurched again, and Marcus tightened his grip as it rumbled beyond the razor wire and down the sloping dirt road that led to the interstate. And when he finally dared exhale, the taste of freedom was mixed with blood from where he had bitten the inside of his cheek to stay quiet. He dropped from the truck only after it turned onto the highway, hitting the ground so hard his vision blurred. But the throbbing pain only sharpened his resolve, pushing him toward the tree line where darkness welcomed him like an ally. He ran until he couldn't hear the road anymore, until the air smelled like pine and damp earth, until his breath steadied enough for him to think clearly again. And the first thing he thought of was the letter, Laura's handwriting, curved and soft. But the message, cruel and final. And Marcus realized that forgiveness wasn't an option, because in prison he'd learned that betrayal was a different kind of violence, a clean slice straight to the soul, and the only answer to violence was retribution. He waited until dawn, hiding in an abandoned service shed, tearing the sleeves off his jumpsuit to blend into the shadows better. And as the first thin rays of light cut through the dust, he remembered the detail that had bothered him most about her letter. She hadn't said she was leaving him. She had said she had found someone, which meant this man, this nameless stranger, had stepped into Marcus's life, touched what belonged to him, whispered things into Laura's ear that Marcus used to say, and that thought alone hardened into the mission that would define everything he did next. He scanned the shed for anything he could use, finding a rusted toolbox with a pair of pliers, a bent screwdriver, and an old prepaid phone someone had tossed aside, cracked but functional, and he used the broken screen to check the prison database number Laura used on visitor logs, noting an unfamiliar number she had listed as emergency contact. And Marcus felt the final piece click into place. He now had a lead. And as he walked out of the shed, pulling the hood of a discarded jacket over his head, he made himself a promise with the calmness of a man already dead inside. He would find Laura. He would find the man she chose over him, and he would make sure betrayal was the last mistake either of them ever made. Marcus Hale moved through the forest with the precision of a hunted animal who had learned to hunt back, his breath steady despite the cold cutting through his thin jacket. And although every muscle in his body ached from the escape, the fire inside him burned brighter with each passing step, because he now had something priceless: Laura's new emergency contact number, the single thread that could unravel everything. He kept walking until he reached a quiet back road where an old gas station stood abandoned, its walls covered in peeling paint and its windows cracked like spiderwebs. And he slipped inside through a broken door, grateful for shelter, but even more grateful for isolation that gave him space to think clearly again. The burner phone he'd found earlier flickered weakly when he turned it on, the shattered corner of the screen glowing just enough for him to dial the mystery number, though his thumb hovered over the call button longer than expected because he wanted to hear the man's voice, wanted to understand the tone, confidence, or carelessness of someone bold enough to step into the life Marcus had bled for. But he also didn't want to alert anyone too early. Finally, he tapped the button, listening closely as the line rang 3 times before a calm, steady male voice answered with a simple, professional hello. And Marcus froze, every instinct sharpening like a blade, because the man didn't sound nervous, didn't sound guilty, didn't sound like the kind of person who fears consequences. It was the voice of a man who believed he had one. And that alone made Marcus hang up immediately. He needed information, not conversation. So he stepped out of the gas station and spotted an old pickup truck parked behind the building, its windows dusty and the door slightly ajar. And inside he found a road map stuffed in the glove compartment, a pair of sunglasses, and most importantly a discarded employee ID belonging to someone named Carl Simmons, who had apparently worked at a local motel chain before quitting, which meant Marcus now had a perfect cover if he needed one. He began walking along the road with his hood up, memorizing every turn while replaying the stranger's voice in his mind, because that one word, hello, held enough weight for Marcus to reconstruct the man's personality: confident, controlled, and far too comfortable with Laura to be a passing phase. The sun climbed higher, warming the asphalt and forcing Marcus to walk in the grass beside the road, where his thoughts drifted to the life he had lost, the dinners Laura once cooked, the late-night conversations they used to have, the promises she made through tears right before his sentencing. But every memory now felt poisoned, twisted into motivations for the mission he could no longer turn away from. By noon, he spotted a small diner with a payphone outside, and after ripping open the receiver box, he used its intact wiring to tap into a local line, then connected the burner phone to an improvised signal booster he built from scrap metal and broken circuits he found near the trash bins. And when the tower pinged, He traced the unknown number through a digital back door he had memorized from years of watching Stonewater's tech staff slip up. The address came back quickly: Evan Carter, 112 Bramble Street. A location less than 25 miles away. In a quiet, middle-class neighborhood Marcus remembered visiting once during a work shift 6 years earlier, a place with trimmed lawns, quiet porches, and the illusion of safety that only people who had never suffered betrayal could believe in. Rage settled under Marcus's ribs like a second heartbeat as he walked behind the diner and found a young Mac mechanic repairing a motorcycle. And while the man's eyes were briefly turned toward a toolbox, Marcus knocked him unconscious with a single blow from a metal rod, dragging him behind a pickup truck before taking the motorcycle keys and a dark denim jacket from the back seat. He started the bike with a sputter, the engine coughing before roaring to life, and as the machine vibrated beneath him, Marcus felt himself transforming not into a fugitive, but into judgment, into the cold answer to Laura's choices and Evan's arrogance. He pushed the throttle hard, the wind cutting across his face as the countryside blurred into streaks of green and brown. And every mile he traveled brought him closer to the truth, closer to the betrayal that had reshaped his soul, and closer to the moment he would confront the man whose existence had turned Marcus Hale into something far more relentless than an escaped inmate. He had become a force that would not stop until the story reached its inevitable, violent conclusion. Marcus reached the edge of Bramble Street just as the afternoon sun dipped low enough to cast long shadows over the pavement, turning the quiet suburban road into a stage where every house looked identical, yet somehow guilty. And as he parked the stolen motorcycle 2 blocks away behind a row of thick hedges, he scanned the surroundings with a calmness that came from 4 years of surviving among killers, liars, and men who could smell fear the moment it rose in someone's throat. Bramble Street felt painfully clean: lawns trimmed to perfect squares, mailboxes freshly painted, children's bicycles leaning neatly against white fences, and Marcus felt something acidic churn inside him at the idea that Laura had slipped so comfortably into a world that pretended danger didn't exist, a world that had forgotten men like him. But he hadn't forgotten anything, not her, not the betrayal, not the man whose voice he still heard echoing in his head. He walked slowly, head down, blending in with the late-day joggers and dog walkers, though every step brought him closer to house number 112, a pale yellow home with navy shutters and a porch swing that swayed lightly in the evening breeze, as if mocking him with its serenity. Marcus paused behind a tall oak tree across the street and watched the front door, his breathing steady, his jaw tight, and just when he wondered whether he had arrived too early, the door opened and Laura stepped out, wearing a soft green sweater that flickered painfully in his memory because he remembered buying it for her on their 3rd anniversary. Remembered how she smiled when she first tried it on, telling him she felt safe with him. And the cruelty of that memory forced Marcus to grip the tree bark hard enough for splinters to dig into his palm. She was talking to someone inside the house, laughing lightly, the same laugh she used to save only for him, and when the second figure stepped into view, Marcus caught his first real glimpse of Evan Carter, the man who had taken everything from him, a tall, clean-cut paramedic with an easy smile and the kind of posture that suggested he had never fought for his life even once. And Marcus felt a cold emptiness spread through him, not rage this time, but a chilling calm, as if his mind had switched into the same survival state he had relied on during the worst moments of prison. He studied Evan carefully, the way he touched Laura's arm gently before locking the door, the way he scanned the street without suspicion, the way he held himself like a man who believed the world was kind to him. And with every observation, Marcus's resolve hardened into something sharper than anger, something precise and deliberate, because now the mission wasn't just personal, it was necessary. He waited until they entered a dark blue SUV parked in the driveway, and while Evan backed out, Marcus recorded the vehicle's license plate with the cracked burner phone, saving it for later tracking. As the car drove away, he stepped out from behind the oak tree and crossed the street, moving with the silent efficiency he had perfected during years of navigating narrow prison corridors where sound meant danger. And when he reached the front porch, he touched the swing lightly, feeling the faint warmth of sunlight still trapped in the wood. Imagining Laura sitting there with Evan, while whispering the same affectionate lies she once whispered to him. A dull ache pressed against Marcus's chest, but he pushed it away, knowing emotions were traps, and traps were luxuries he could not afford. So he focused instead on evaluating the house, noting the number of windows, the angles of security cameras, the deadbolt marks, and the sidelight glass beside the door that could be shattered in seconds if needed. After circling the property slowly, pretending to be a delivery man checking addresses, Marcus found the side entrance that led to a small garden lined with lavender plants, and he crouched down to examine. A pair of footprints in the soft soil, Laura's delicate shoe prints, and a larger set that matched Evan's athletic build, proof that the two of them had been building a life without him, decorating gardens, establishing routines, and rewriting history as if Marcus had never existed. But he did exist. He existed more now than ever. And as he stood up and looked through the back window at a living room filled with photographs he couldn't fully see, he made a silent vow that none of this would last. Before leaving, he reached into a potted plant near the back door and placed a small folded scrap of the prison shirt he had torn during his escape, a silent warning that would mean nothing to Evan but everything to Laura. Then he slipped back toward the hedges, ready to follow their SUV wherever it had gone. Because Marcus Hale was no longer searching, he had officially begun the hunt. Marcus waited until the blue SUV disappeared beyond the bend of Bramble Street before slipping back toward his stolen motorcycle, moving with the deliberate caution of a man who understood that the smallest mistake could unravel everything. And as he mounted the bike and adjusted the denim jacket he'd taken earlier, he felt the familiar thrum of adrenaline building beneath his ribs, a steady, focused fire that sharpened his senses rather than clouding them. The engine roared to life with a low growl, and Marcus pulled onto the road, keeping several cars between himself and the SUV, so neither Laura nor Evan would notice the shadow following them. Bramble Street opened into a wider avenue lined with small shops, dog groomers, coffee stands, and carefully manicured storefronts that all felt offensively peaceful to a man who had spent years staring at concrete and steel bars. And the contrast only deepened Marcus's sense of distance from the life that had once been his. Ahead, Evan drove casually, one hand on the wheel, the other gesturing as Laura laughed at something he said, and Marcus felt an icy calm settle over him as he watched her smile she had sworn she could never give anyone else. Somehow seeing it now didn't trigger anger, but a strange, detached clarity, as if he were watching two strangers act out a scene from a life he had never belonged to. He followed them past the town square toward the main highway, adjusting his speed whenever Evan slowed at intersections, careful never to appear too close in the rearview mirror. And when they merged into the freeway, Marcus drifted into the far left lane, keeping them in sight while blending between a line of trucks. The autumn wind whipped against his face, carrying the scent of pine and the distant hum of traffic, and as he rode, he replayed the moment he had first seen Evan, his posture, his easy smile, the comfortable familiarity he had with Laura, and Marcus analyzed him the same way he used to analyze threats inside Stonewater. No impulsiveness, no visible insecurity, no signs of being a man forced into survival, which meant Evan was the type who believed danger was something that happened to other people, not to him. That belief alone made him vulnerable, and Marcus stored that observation like a weapon. 20 minutes later, the SUV exited the highway toward a bustling shopping complex filled with families, teenagers, and weekend shoppers, a place so public that even Marcus felt momentarily unsettled, knowing he could not afford to draw attention or risk being seen by any police cams nearby. He parked the motorcycle near a row of trees behind a grocery store and slipped inside the crowd, pulling his hood low as he tracked Laura and Evan from a safe distance. Watching them enter a pharmacy where Evan's paramedic uniform badge gave him easy access to medical supplies he probably purchased for work, Marcus leaned against a newspaper stand, pretending to read headlines while observing them through the reflection of the vending machine next to him. And he noted carefully how Laura held onto Evan's arm, how close they stood, how natural their comfort seemed, and every detail carved deeper into the silent promise Marcus had made to himself when he escaped. But he also knew patience was essential. Striking too soon would destroy his advantage, so he continued to follow them after they exited the pharmacy and entered a cafe, choosing a seat near the window where they could be observed. Marcus circled the building, slipping into the alley behind it, where he found an empty delivery door that allowed him a clear line of sight through the back window. And from there he watched them sit across from each other, sipping coffee, laughing softly, unaware that the man they had tried to erase from their lives was studying their every move. He took note of Evan's mannerisms, the way he held his cup, the way he scanned the room, the way he rested his hand on Laura's wrist with casual possession. And each observation added to the psychological blueprint Marcus was building for the inevitable confrontation. After 20 minutes, they stood and walked out, heading toward a small medical clinic across the parking lot, and Marcus followed by weaving through the rows of cars, never stepping into open view. The clinic door shut behind them, leaving Marcus alone in the fading afternoon light, the long shadows stretching across the asphalt like silent witnesses. And in that moment he understood something crucial. Not only was Evan predictable, he was consistent, following routines tied to his job and his comfortable suburban life. Routines that Marcus could track, study, and eventually use against him. The sun dipped lower as Marcus lingered behind a dumpster, mapping the clinic's exits, counting security cameras, and memorizing the positions of nearby vehicles and by the time Laura and Evan emerged, he had already decided that the time to strike was approaching, not immediately, but soon enough that the betrayal would return to them like a storm they never saw coming. Marcus waited until Laura and Evan had driven away from the clinic, letting their SUV merge into the soft evening traffic while he remained hidden behind the dumpster, watching the fading daylight stretch long shadows across the parking lot like dark veins running through concrete. He had spent hours tracking them, studying their movements, and every new detail he collected sharpened the shape of the plan forming in his mind. A plan that required patience, not the raw, impulsive rage he might have fallen into years ago, but a colder, more calculated version of himself. The man Stonewater had carved from bone and fear. When the area finally quieted down, Marcus stepped out carefully, pulled his hood lower, and moved toward the row of cars at the far end of the lot until he found Evan's SUV parked again, this time behind a small community center they had apparently entered for some brief errand. Marcus crouched behind the bumper of a nearby van, his pulse steady as he studied the vehicle from every angle, noting the patterns of dust on the windows, the faint scratches around the lock, and the front grille where leaves were still wedged from their earlier drive through the suburban neighborhood. The familiarity of the SUV gnawed at Marcus like a reminder that these two people had built a life so normal that even their car looked like a symbol of quiet domesticity. The exact kind of life Marcus had once believed Laura wanted with him. But now she shared it with another man who walked confidently beside her while she clutched his arm, never looking back to consider who she had left behind. Marcus slipped around to the rear of the SUV, checking for cameras, pedestrians, or anyone who might notice him, then pulled out the small scrap of torn prison shirt he had carried in his pocket, the same material he had left in the potted plant at Evan's house because warnings didn't have to be loud to be terrifying. They just had to be unmistakable. With careful fingers, he tucked the scrap behind the windshield wiper, making sure it would be the first thing Laura or Evan saw when they approached the car. And as he stepped back, he imagined the moment Laura would freeze, the color draining from her face as recognition struck, because she would know instantly, instinctively, that Marcus had been here, that he had found them, that Stonewater's walls were no longer enough to hold him back from the life they had stolen. But this wasn't enough, not yet, because Marcus needed Evan to feel it too, needed him to understand the weight of what he had stepped into. So he circled to the side of the SUV, knelt down, and pressed his fingers against the dusty paint, drawing a subtle line through the dirt, just a small, sharp slash near the handle, a mark that meant nothing to anyone else but would feel intentional to the man who found it. When he finished, Marcus ducked into the shadows again, slipping between two parked sedans and watching intently as the community center doors swung open. Children spilled out first, laughing as they raced toward their parents' cars, and behind them a handful of adults, talking about schedules, homework, and weekend plans. Then Laura appeared, her hair glowing faintly in the overhead lamps, while she smiled at something Evan said. And though the sight stung Marcus with a brief flash of the past, the feeling dissolved quickly into focused detachment. They walked toward the SUV, and Marcus leaned forward slightly, just enough to see their faces clearly, but not enough to be seen himself. Laura reached the windshield first, her hand freezing mid-motion as her eyes landed on the piece of prison fabric. And even from a distance, Marcus saw the shift, the tightening of her jaw, the widening of her eyes, the tremor in her breath as she slowly lifted the scrap between trembling fingers. Evan stepped beside her, confused at first, then frowning with the kind of forced confidence Marcus had already predicted from him, the bravado of a man who had never met real danger. He took the fabric from Laura, examined it, glanced around the lot as if expecting a prankster to jump out, then slid it irritably into his pocket. But Laura wasn't fooled. Marcus could see her, scanning the shadows, searching for the ghost she hoped she would never face again. In that moment, that silent fear in her posture confirmed that she understood exactly what the warning meant. Evan's attempt to comfort her only made the contrast clearer. He had no idea what Marcus was capable of, no understanding of the man she had once promised to wait for. And when he placed his arm around her shoulders, telling her it was probably nothing, she didn't even fully nod, because deep down she knew there were only two kinds of warnings Marcus ever gave in his life: the kind that came before something, and the kind that came right before everything. As their SUV finally drove away, Marcus whispered to himself, not in rage but in certainty. The hunt had officially begun, and they were already far behind. The moment Daniel Pierce slipped beyond the prison's outer fence, disappearing into the tree line like a shadow peeling itself from the world, he felt a terrifying calm settle over him, a cold, calculated silence that smothered every sense except the one pulling him forward toward Emily and the man he believed had stolen his life. And as he moved deeper into the forest, with nothing but the stolen guard uniform on his back and a makeshift plan carved out of desperation, he forced himself to breathe slowly, quietly, reminding himself that every step mattered now in a way nothing else ever had. The ground under his boots was soft with pine needles, the sky a dim pre-dawn gray, and each distant echo a branch snapping. A bird rustling overhead made him pause, crouch, and listen, convinced for a heartbeat that the guards were closing in. But every time the forest whispered back with nothing but emptiness, he pressed on, his mind replaying the last visit in the prison meeting room where Emily had confessed through trembling lips that she needed space, a phrase that had felt worse than the sentence he was serving. And as he pushed forward, he thought of her new address, a detail he had memorized months ago during a casual comment she made, never imagining it would become the destination of a hunted man carving a path toward betrayal. By the time he reached the old service road that cut across the woods, dawn had begun bleeding into the sky, washing the trees in pale light. And Daniel knew he had to move quickly, as the prison would have discovered the missing guard, the unconscious one locked in a supply closet, and his own absence from the work detail, and the search perimeter would begin expanding any moment. So he kept his head low, stuck to the ditch beside the road, and walked until a rusted pickup truck appeared parked beside an abandoned shed, its keys dangling from the ignition as if placed there by fate. And though he knew stealing it would only escalate everything, the need to reach Emily burned hotter than logic itself. So he climbed in, started the engine, and drove down the winding rural highway, his nerves tight as piano wire each time a car passed in the opposite lane. As the miles peeled away and towns drifted past, He tried to imagine what Emily might be doing at that very moment, sleeping, cooking breakfast, lying beside him, and those thoughts twisted in his chest until anger knotted with heartbreak, forming a storm he had no words for. And though he hated himself for it, he replayed every rumor he had heard from visiting inmates claiming they'd seen her with another man. Rumors that had eaten through him like acid until the night he snapped, punching a wall until his knuckles split. And now here he was, driving toward the truth with the same broken hands gripping the steering wheel. By the time he reached the outskirts of Cedar Ridge, the small town where Emily had moved, his pulse hammered so violently he thought it might shake the truck apart, and he parked behind an abandoned diner, wiping sweat from his face as the reality of what he was doing finally crashed into him with brutal weight, reminding him that there was no turning back now, not with the police hunting him and the story of the escape likely filling every radio station. And he sat there for a long moment, staring at the cracked steering wheel as the sun climbed over the horizon, filling the sky with gold that felt sickeningly peaceful considering the darkness building inside him. Eventually he stepped out, pulled the stolen jacket tight, and blended into the early morning crowd drifting along the sidewalk. Keeping his head down as he approached the street he remembered from Emily's letters, and when he turned the corner and saw the small blue house with the white porch railing, the sight hit him like a punch to the ribs because through the window, framed perfectly by the morning light, he saw them, Emily and a man he had never met, sitting close together at the kitchen table, laughing softly over coffee, unaware that the quiet, broken figure watching them from the sidewalk had walked through hell to stand exactly where he stood. And as Daniel stepped back into the shadow of a nearby tree, the trembling in his hands returned, the storm inside him cracked open, and the choice that would define everything that followed began pulling him forward with a force he could no longer resist. Daniel stood hidden beneath the broad shadow of the maple tree, his breath shallow as he watched Emily and the unknown man inside the kitchen, their distant laughter drifting through the morning air like a cruel reminder of the life he no longer belonged to. And as he pressed his hand against the rough bark behind him, he felt a strange hollowness spreading through his chest. Not anger exactly, but a deep, cold ache that made it hard to breathe. Because in that moment he realized that the world had kept moving without him, reshaping itself while he remained trapped behind steel doors and concrete walls, clinging to the memory of a woman who had already stepped forward into another life. Still, he could not walk away. Not after everything he had risked to get here. And as he leaned closer, squinting through the glint of sunlight hitting the window, he studied the man beside Hertel, early 30s perhaps, clean-shaven, the kind of calm confidence Daniel had never managed to carry even before prison had stripped pieces of him away. And the man reached out to brush a crumb from Emily's cheek, a small gesture that twisted something sharp inside Daniel, who lowered his gaze, swallowed hard, and forced himself to think clearly. Because if he let emotion drive him now, the spiral would consume him entirely. He needed answers, not rage, he told himself, though the words rang hollow. And as the couple stood and moved away from the window, Daniel finally stepped back from the tree, scanning the quiet street where joggers passed. A dog barked in a nearby yard, and someone watered flowers on a porch. All of it so painfully ordinary that he felt like a ghost drifting through a world that no longer recognized him, and he forced himself to walk away before anyone noticed his presence. Turning down the sidewalk toward a row of small stores at the end of the block where he could lose himself in the morning foot traffic long enough to figure out what came next. Inside a corner cafe, he sat at a table near the window, keeping his head down as he ordered a coffee with a voice barely above a whisper. And as he wrapped his hands around the warm cup, he became acutely aware of how out of place he looked. Crumpled clothes, weary eyes, tension stretching across every line of his face. And he imagined the headline already spreading across the state. Escaped inmate at large, his mugshot flashing across televisions in living rooms just like Emily's. The thought made him shift uneasily, scanning each person who entered, convinced that at any moment someone would recognize him. But the town moved slowly, calmly, unaware of the storm. Sitting quietly at a cafe table, Daniel sipped the bitter coffee as he replayed the image of Emily's smile, a smile he once believed belonged to him alone. And he remembered the nights they used to stay awake, talking about useless little things. The color she wanted to paint the kitchen, the trip they promised to take someday, and he wondered if she remembered any of it, or if those memories had faded the way his had been forced to, replaced by the routine of prison life, where the walls smothered every dream. And he found himself gripping the cup too tightly, knuckles white, breath shaky, as he realized the truth he had been avoiding since the moment he escaped. He had come not only for her, but for closure, for something to fill the hollow space left inside him. Yet now that he had seen her living calmly, happily, with someone else, he no longer understood what he wanted from her or from himself. The confusion churned until he finally stood, leaving the cafe and drifting down the sidewalk toward the small hardware store next door, where he stepped inside, more out of instinct than intention, pretending to browse while he listened to the radio behind the counter, its static crackle giving way to a reporter's urgent voice announcing that Daniel Pierce had escaped at approximately 4:17 a.m. and was considered dangerous, prompting Daniel to stiffen, his pulse spiking as the cashier glanced at the radio and then at him, narrowing their eyes slightly as if trying to match his face to the description. And Daniel quickly turned, walking out before suspicion sharpened into certainty. Outside, the air felt heavier, thick with the knowledge that time was running out. And as he moved back toward Emily's neighborhood, using alleys instead of sidewalks, something inside him shifted, the early hesitation hardening into a stark, decisive resolve that had nothing to do with rage and everything to do with the belief that he could not leave without confronting Emily and ending the story that had already taken too much from him. And with that thought anchoring itself in his mind, he stepped back into the shadows of the street where her house waited, unaware that the man who had once promised to love her forever was now walking toward the front door with a purpose he could no longer turn away from. Daniel approached the blue house with the slow, deliberate steps of someone walking toward a truth he had feared for far too long, his breath steady but shallow, his pulse thudding against his ribs as he stayed close to the hedges lining the edge of the yard, scanning the quiet street for any passing car that might carry someone who recognized him from the morning news. And when he reached the porch stairs, he paused at the bottom, gripping the railing as memories from years ago washed over him. Emily, standing at this same porch, laughing, waving him over, telling him she loved him in the soft way only she could. And for a moment he felt the weight of everything he had lost pressing so heavily against him that he struggled to stand upright. But the feeling hardened quickly into a sharper determination that pushed him onward until he climbed each step, stopping before the door where he stood completely still, listening to the faint hum of voices from inside. He hesitated, unsure whether to knock or simply walk away. Yet walking away felt impossible, like trying to turn from the gravity of a planet. So he lifted his hand, ready to knock. But before he could make contact, the door cracked open, as if the house itself had anticipated his arrival. And standing on the other side was the man from the kitchen, his expression shifting instantly from casual curiosity to alarm as his eyes widened in recognition. Not because he knew Daniel personally, but because he had clearly seen the morning news report. And Daniel reacted before the man could speak, pushing the door gently but firmly open as he stepped inside, whispering for him to stay calm and saying he only wanted to talk to Emily. The man lifted his hands slightly, not in fear but in a cautious attempt to keep the situation from spiraling, and he called out Emily's name over his shoulder, prompting her to appear in the hallway a second later, her face draining of color the moment she saw Daniel standing in her doorway unshaven, tense, exhausted, and impossibly, terrifyingly real. After she had convinced herself the past was locked away where it belonged, Daniel felt the floor tilt beneath him when their eyes met, and for a moment everything became unbearably quiet as he whispered her name, unsure whether he was begging for forgiveness or simply reminding himself that she was not a dream. And Emily took a small step back as she asked him softly what he was doing there, her voice trembling but controlled in a way that suggested she was fighting to stay calm, not for her own sake, but for the man beside her. Daniel explained that he had escaped, that he had followed the truth of the rumors he'd heard, and that he needed to understand why she had moved on without him, why she had built an entirely new world while he was trapped in the wreckage of the old one. And Emily, still pale and shaken, told him in a quiet, steady voice that she had tried to wait, that she had visited for years, until the weight of his sentence crushed every hope they once had, and that she had finally accepted the truth that they could not keep pretending life had paused while he was gone, because life had kept moving, dragging her along with it. Daniel felt the words hit him like a slow, suffocating wave, and he struggled to breathe as he looked around the living room photographs on the wall. A coat draped casually over a chair, remnants of normalcy he had long forgotten. He turned back to Emily with a hollow, trembling expression, asking if she had ever truly loved him, or if the years had washed everything away. And Emily stepped closer, her voice soft but steady, as she said she had loved him once, deeply, but that love could not survive the walls he lived behind or the choices that led him there. The man beside her remained silent, standing between them now in a protective but respectful manner, and Daniel felt the last piece of his composure crack as he took a step back, realizing that the person he had fought so desperately to reach was no longer his to hold on to, that the life he had imagined reclaiming had already slipped from his grasp long before he escaped, overwhelmed, trembling, and drowning in the reality he had never prepared himself to face. Daniel turned toward the open door as distant sirens began rising from somewhere in town, faint but growing louder, and Emily whispered his name one last time, a soft farewell carried on a voice he once believed would stay with him forever. But he did not turn back. Stepping off the porch into the sunlight, as the approaching sirens echoed through the quiet neighborhood like the final closing of a door he had spent years trying to reopen, Daniel stepped back from the doorstep, the air heavy with the scent of early morning and freshly cut grass, his mind racing as the sirens grew louder in the distance. And he felt the strange duality of freedom and fear pressing down on him like a weight that could crush a man in seconds. Because, though he had reached Emily and confronted the truth he had spent months chasing, he now understood that escaping the prison had only led him into a far more dangerous trap, one crafted by the law, the world, and his own obsession. He moved quickly, staying low, hugging the shadows along the side of the house, the gravel crunching faintly under his boots with every careful step. And though his eyes darted to the street where police vehicles would soon arrive, his thoughts kept returning to Emily, to her face the mixture of shock, fear, and a trace of compassion he could not understand in. He realized that she was no longer the woman who had once waited for him, that the life he had imagined reclaiming had already been rewritten in ways he could not undo, and that truth, sharp and bitter, cut deeper than the bars ever could. His hands twitched at his sides, itching for action. But he knew impulsive moves now would be catastrophic. So he forced himself to focus on the immediate, the simple act of disappearing, of moving without being seen while the world was still catching up to the reality of his escape. Daniel retraced his steps through the narrow alley behind the house, ducking into the shadow of the fence that separated the properties, moving with the precision of a predator who had spent years learning to track, waiting for the perfect moment to vanish. And as he reached the street corner, he spotted a small delivery truck parked with its rear doors open, and after a careful glance at the surrounding area, he slipped inside, closing the doors just enough to remain hidden, and felt the muffled thrum of life from the neighborhood beyond. Families moving toward breakfast, dogs barking, cars pulling away. Unaware of the danger, crouched just a few meters away in their quiet morning. Inside the truck, he crouched and allowed himself to breathe slowly, running a hand over his face, thinking about how far he had come, how many boundaries he had crossed to get to this point, and how uncertain the next step would be, because he knew the authorities would not stop until he was caught. Yet he also knew that a part of him could not let the morning end without leaving a mark, a reminder that he had been there, that he had confronted the truth, and that betrayal came with consequences. He thought about Evan, about the man's casual gestures, the comfort with which he had held Emily, and he imagined the man discovering the subtle warnings Marcus or Daniel had left. The way the scrap of prison shirt had fluttered in the breeze, the carved mark in the dirt, the silent signs that someone had been closer than they could see. And for a moment, Daniel felt a satisfaction he could not fully explain, even as he knew that the satisfaction would not absolve him of the chaos he had unleashed. As the truck engine idled, he planned his escape route, noting every turn and side street, every alleyway and shortcut, preparing for the inevitable pursuit. And in the quiet of the vehicle, he allowed himself a brief mental rehearsal, imagining how he would disappear into the city, merge with the crowds, and avoid capture while still carrying the weight of the confrontation he had just endured. The sun climbed higher now, spilling light across the rooftops, glinting on car hoods and the edges of fences. And Daniel felt a pang of realization that he was no longer the same man who had stepped onto the streets 4 hours ago. That every moment of his escape, every calculated step, every silent observation, had changed him irrevocably. And as he finally pushed the rear doors open and stepped into a side street, blending into the shadows, he understood that the hunt was not over, that the consequences of his choices would stretch far beyond the quiet neighborhood, and that the freedom he had fought so desperately for came with a price he was only beginning to comprehend. And yet, despite every warning, every heartbeat of fear and adrenaline, he kept moving, resolute, silent, determined to remain unseen, to survive, and to face whatever lay ahead on his path, knowing that by the time the world caught up, it might already be too late. Daniel moved silently through the narrow side streets of Cedar Ridge, the weight of every step pressing down like a drumbeat of inevitability, knowing that the chase, the months of planning, the nights spent imagining every scenario, had all led to this moment. And though the morning sun stretched long shadows across lawns and sidewalks, casting everything in a deceptively calm light, he felt the tension coiling tighter with every corner he passed. The knowledge that law enforcement would be combing every route, adding urgency to his already calculated movements. He paused briefly behind a low fence, peering at Emily's house from a distance, noting the familiar blue siding and the neatly trimmed yard, the porch swaying lightly in the breeze, as if mocking him with its serenity. And he clenched his fists, forcing himself to focus, reminding himself that he could not falter now, that every decision in the next minutes would define what came after, and whether he survived or failed depended entirely on precision and control. As he advanced toward the driveway, he spotted Evan pulling a small duffel from the SUV, unaware that someone watched him from the shadows. And Daniel felt a flicker of the old, relentless instinct that had carried him through Stonewater. The knowledge that this was a man who had no idea what danger was until it stood before him. And that realization gave Daniel the upper hand, sharpening his senses and allowing him to move like a ghost through the crisp morning air, silent and deliberate, every footstep measured to avoid detection. He ducked behind a low hedge, calculating the distance to the porch, the positioning of the vehicles, the potential escape routes, and the minor obstacles like loose paving stones and small garden ornaments, all of which could mean success or disaster in a moment. And as he did, he felt Emily appear behind the screen door, her face pale, eyes wide, a mixture of fear, recognition, and the echo of emotions she thought she had long buried. And Daniel's heart clenched, not in longing but in the raw, unfiltered reality of what he had sacrificed, and what she had sacrificed as she took a cautious step backward, subtly signaling Evan without words. Daniel exhaled slowly, the air tasting of pine and asphalt, and he considered the possibilities: confrontation, escape, negotiation, or simply observation, and chose the path that kept him in control, remaining in the shadow of the hedge while studying both of them, understanding that dominance came not from anger but from presence, from patience, from the knowledge that he had already walked through fire to reach this point, and that neither they nor the authorities could now dictate the rhythm of his decisions. The minutes stretched, silent and loaded, until finally Evan glanced toward the hedge and noticed subtle movement, and Daniel allowed a deliberate step into partial visibility, enough to unnerve the man without fully exposing himself. And the instant tension that flashed across Evan's face confirmed what Daniel had anticipated. Evan was competent, but he had never faced someone with nothing left to lose. Someone who had already crossed the boundaries of fear and legality to reach them. Emily whispered a name, perhaps Daniel's, perhaps a plea, and he held up his hands slightly, signaling no harm, no rash action, only the assertion of presence. And the three of them froze in the sunlight, time stretching impossibly long as he allowed them to absorb the reality of his escape, his arrival, and the inevitability that their lives had already shifted irrevocably the moment he had stepped back onto Cedar Ridge streets. And in that suspended instant, Daniel understood that the power he carried now was not of brute force, but of psychological dominion, the ability to unsettle, to challenge, to confront the lies and routines that had attempted to replace what was lost. And he felt the final surge of adrenaline course through his veins as he stepped fully out of the shadows, meeting Emily's eyes and Evan's glare, knowing that whatever followed from retreat to resolution would mark the conclusion of this chapter, and that the echoes of today's confrontation would haunt the quiet neighborhood long after he vanished into the world beyond, leaving behind a story of betrayal, obsession, and relentless pursuit that neither law nor love could ever fully contain.